Does this look a better necklace than the other one? Okay, is this going to be a regular feature of the talk? So, the rise of the 4 Asian tigers, but of course they were relatively small populations. What really changed the game was when Deng Xiaoping in 1978 introduced his economic reforms, reform and opening up, something which is the West is disgracefully ignorant about, academia is disgracefully ignorant about, and economics as an academic discipline is, because this has been the most successful economic approach in modern times, way more important than neoliberalism, and yet no one talks about it. Anyway, then there follows this, of course, other countries then join in, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the whole area of East Asia, home to 1/3 of the world's population, is sort of then drawn into this extraordinary economic transformation. And China, which had been growing during the Mao period at roughly 5.5% a year, suddenly from 1978, almost immediately, its growth rate increases to around 10%, and that is sustained for 35 years. China, at the beginning of the process, was just 5% the size of the American economy. By 2014, we'll now test to see if this works. Yes. By 2014, according to the World Bank International Comparison Program, China overtook the size of the American economy by GDP measured by primary purchasing power. And so we have the transformation of East Asia to becoming the most dynamic and now the largest economic region in the world. And I want to start really my talk in earnest with this map. Now, this map tells an extraordinary story. It's drawn up by Danny Quah, who was at LSE and is now Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. Now I'm going to see if I can operate all this. Yeah, okay. So, and what Danny tried to do was to work out historically at each stage where the center of the global economy was. I mean, historically, clearly, in the modern times, Europe was the center of the global economy. And then, with the rise of America, the center of gravity shifted to America. And what you had in 1980, which is where Danny starts, is the center of the global economy being more or less what you'd expect, which is, this is the beginning of 1980, remember? Thatcher, Reagan, beginning of globalization, neoliberal globalization. And the global economy was essentially a transatlantic economy, or more accurately, a North Atlantic economy. And then, remember what I was just saying about the rise of East Asia? Here's East Asia, okay? There's Indonesia, there's somewhere. I don't think they're very well drawn, these. Okay, never mind. I never thought of it like that. Anyway, don't take it too literally. So it begins to shift the center of the global economy like this, you see. This is over time. So today, it's there, just about there. Okay? So it's now to the east of the Persian Gulf. And by 2050, his prediction, I think it might be sooner, but anyway, by 2050, it will be on the Sino-Indian border. Now think about this, because everyone here who's, at least from Europe or the States, has grown up in a world where we were at the center of that world. And everyone else, the great majority of the world's population, were on the outside looking in. If you were from, for example, Malaysia or Indonesia or Korea or Japan or anywhere, or obviously Latin America or Africa, you looked either to London and then later to New York as the center of the world. If you wanted to go anywhere, if you wanted to travel anywhere, the lines were essentially from east to west. I mean, when I first started visiting, my wife is Malaysian, and all her friends were, they travelled to London, especially because it was an old British colony. They didn't know anything about their region. They never went to Vietnam. They never went to Indonesia. They might go to Singapore, but that was just a few miles away. But essentially where they went, the Mecca, if you like, was to go to Europe or maybe especially the States, depending on where you came from. If you're Korean, you go to the States, not to Europe, and so on. And I think we so readily take this for granted, that the West is the center of the world, that it's just implicit in our assumptions about the way we see things. That this is where the best universities are, this is where the best ideas are, these are where the power is, this is where the prosperity is, and so on. Now, for you, but especially for the next generation, it will be completely different. Because the center of the world is going to be here. And we will experience the inversion of our assumptions. We will become the outsiders looking in. Now, of course, it will not happen overnight. This is a long historical process. But given the extraordinary nature of it, it's actually, in historical terms, happening extremely quickly. So this map, I think, is, in a way, the most important thing I can say to you today, given the assumptions about the rise of China and so on, is to think of what's happening there or what's happening here in terms of this extraordinary transition to a very different different world. And yes, okay, just reminding myself where I've got to here. Now, the process that this has happened has been, the impact of it has been obviously happened over a period since the rise, since the beginning of the rise of China, really, because the impact of the Asian tigers was much more limited, and it's been experienced in waves, and there are two kind of waves, really. One is once it moved outside of East Asia, then the impact, and especially to China, there was a dual impact. There was the impact on the developed world, on the Western world, and of course Japan was very influenced by it in various ways. And then there was the impact on the developing world. And they are rather distinct, actually, because the impact on the developing world is much bigger so far than the impact on the developed world. And I think this is, and I'll come back to this, this is absolutely part of a Chinese strategic approach. It feels itself to have an affinity with the developing world, and therefore, unlike the West, it has thought deeply about its relationship with the developing world and is very committed to it. I'll come back to that. But everywhere, you know, here's Australia, okay? This is one of the second most important example after the United States of European expansion and settlement, destruction of the native population or virtual destruction of a native population, as happened in America. And it's always been politically, had a very strong sense of itself as white and very strongly linked, obviously, as a former British colony to Britain, but especially since the Second World War to America. So in some ways it's very, what I would call quite regressive, historically speaking. And here's Australia, not so far from China, and Australia, which is very committed, as part of the Western Alliance and all that kind of thing, found itself by about 10 years ago that a quarter of its exports went to China, a quarter, from very little. And how do you, so China becomes easily its most important customer. So, and the Australian economy begins to reflect the Shanghai Stock Exchange more than any Western economy. And yet, historically and contemporaneously, its leanings are profoundly to the West. So it came up with this formula. I'm giving you this as an example. The formula was, America is our ally, China is our friend. Of course, this is really a matter of doing the splits. Because this, especially in the era of Trump and so on, is a very difficult position to sustain. But anyway, so I'm just giving you this as an example. It has a big impact on America because of trade. I shall come back to that later. It has a major impact on Europe, but not often. It comes and it goes, the impact and discussion, the impact of China and the discussion on China. But anyway, you begin to feel more and more the presence of China in the world. And this process has been going on now, well, effectively, I would argue, since probably the turn of the century is really when it begins to get, the beginning of this century begins to get felt strongly. Now, the one thing I forgot to say, and I do want to say, is that the way East Asia itself got transformed, because prior to the 90s, basically the export markets of countries in Northeast and Southeast Asia were America and Japan. And in the 90s, this changed profoundly as China increasingly became the major trading partner of more and more of these countries, such that today, every country in East Asia, remember a third of the world's population, now counts China as its main trading partner. And one of the things that's happened is that America's position in East Asia, which used to be formidable, is now a pale shadow of what it was. Beyond the point, it's no longer a major economic player in this region. Remember, the most important economic region in the world. And its power rests purely, really, or mainly, not purely, but mainly on its military presence in the region, which is essentially a naval presence. For example, the Seventh Fleet, it spends most of its time in the South China Sea. And America is a waning, but America is a waning force, and there have been various attempts to change that, Obama's pivot to Asia and so on. But anyway, it's all failed. It will fail because America is a declining economic power, not just in this region, but this region it's very marked because of the rise of, this is where the rise of China has taken place. Now, this process that I'm talking about should be seen in a broader economic sense. You see, what's happening is basically the West, in its various incarnations, particularly the States and the EU, is relatively speaking in the world much poorer than it used to be. If you look at currency reserves, if you look at manufacturing capacity, if you look at infrastructural development, if you look at growth rates and so on, the centre of gravity of the world has moved decisively from the West to this part of the world, China most markedly, but not only China. And so, so you've got this, big shift taking place. It's reflected in institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. Those kind of Western institutions used to be very important. I don't think they are any longer that important. Why? Because they just don't have the resources anymore. Why? Because essentially they were funded by Western governments, and the Western governments haven't got the wherewithal that they used to have, and so on. So the IMF has become, it helps here, it helps there, it helped during the, in Europe after the Western financial crisis and so on. But, in terms of its role or presence in the developing world, likewise with the World Bank, it hasn't got so many resources as it used to do. No, what's happened is something else, which is the development of new institutions, usually China-based, like, I'll come back to this, like Belt and Road, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which, let's see whether I've got a slide for that. I mean, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, you may remember, was founded in 2014, and it started off with just these countries here. Basically 22, because it doesn't include Indonesia, because Indonesia was having an presidential election at the time, so it didn't immediately join. But all the countries, basically, of East Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia joined it. Then, something remarkable happened for the first time, and one of the few times Britain began to look into the future rather than looking into the past. And Osborne, particularly a key figure, and the Cameron government, applied to join the AIIB against American resistance, probably the most important independent stance that Britain has taken vis-à-vis America since 1945. Good for them. Shame it didn't last. And Britain joined, and then suddenly lots of other countries applied to join, many European countries and so on. So China's first venture into multilateral institutions, this was crowned with great success. I think there's now over 100 countries that have joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And other examples of this are the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, the organization that brings together China, Brazil, and Russia, and India, and South Africa. Anyway, now, let me pull this together with a pie chart which will probably take your breath away, which is, you've got to be careful with these projections, but these are from Hu Hongong, who's a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. But there are quite a few others who are projecting what the global economy will look like in 2030. I think probably it needs to be, we're probably talking more like 2035 now. But look at that. China will account, this is GDP by PPP again, China will account for 1/3 of the global economy. By the way, in 1820 it also accounted for 1/3 of the global economy. So you could say status quo ante. But these figures are extraordinary, you see. There's China, there's the United States. Half the size, less than half the size of the Chinese economy. And the European Union and the States together, smaller than China. And, see, the other great wave, but still in its very early stages and more uncertainty associated with it, is the rise of India. So there you have a bit earlier than Danny Qua's 2050, these two countries accounting for about getting on for half the global economy. So that underpins the great, that helps to explain just what extraordinary forces are at work here. Now, the consequence of this is what I want to sum up in two ideas. One is centripetalism, and the other is centrifugalism, to try and understand what is happening in the world. Let's go back to Danny Quo's map. You see, as basically what's happening is that China, because of its rise, and in the region, the rise and importance of East Asia, is exercising increasingly a major gravitational pull across the world, everywhere, okay? Everywhere there is now a China factor, for example. However small the economy is, there is some kind of leaning or desire to engage with China. Of course there is, because that's where the money is, that's where the business is, that's where the influence is, that's where, you know, I mean, think of universities in this country or the States have become increasingly dependent on Chinese students. 1/3 of the international students in the United States are Chinese, and they've become more and more important here. That's just one example. Or take peacekeeping operations of the UN. China now accounts, I think China pays, I'll stand corrected if I say, but funds about 1/3, if it's not more than that, of all peacekeeping operations of the United Nations. So you've got this immense gravitational pull, and there are some really classic examples of this. You see, with the rise of the West, countries were obliged, usually in the era of colonialism, to become westernized or became colonized. So, for example, in this region, most countries in East Asia were colonized by the British or the French or later the Americans in some shape or form, Philippines and so on. And Japan only escaped colonization because in 1867 it could see the writing on the wall, and it adopted the Meiji Restoration, which is a very big political term in Japan, if you don't know about it, and it decided to westernize itself. But to do it was a very interesting experiment, but tried to do it on its terms. Very difficult to do it on your own terms in that situation, but Japan was largely successful in doing it. China was unsuccessful. China didn't succeed, and this was what led to the Century of Humiliation starting in the 1840s with the Opium Wars, the seizure of Hong Kong in the subsequent unequal treaties and so on. Now, how did I get back to there? Right. Let me give you an example here. Russia, okay? This is a big landmass, Russia. And Russia has always been essentially antipathetic to China. It's a long history since Peter the Great. Although Russia occupies a large part of the Asian landmass because of Siberia and so on, but it's very lightly populated, Russia always looked really, although it was not part of straightforwardly the Western tradition, it's always looked to the West, to Europe and so on. And so, you know, and so the main cities, Moscow, and obviously the old capital of St. Petersburg and so on. And in this recent period, there's been an extraordinary shift in Russian foreign policy towards China. And they are now, I mean, Belt and Road could have been very conflictual between the two, but actually Russia's in a weak position. It's very different from China in all sorts of ways, and it's now leaning very, very heavily towards China. Or take Turkey. Turkey's a very interesting example. You know, Ataturk after the First World War, you know, after the Ottoman Empire and so on. I mean, Turkey westernized and downplayed its Islamic fundamental Islamic roots and so on. And what's been happening is exactly the opposite since then. Under Erdogan and so on, and Turkey at the same time, although you know, is leaning. It's part of Belt and Road. It's leaned very heavily. It sees its idea of the middle corridor, which is part of its economic strategy, to be aligned with Belt and Road and so on. Or take in Europe. I mean, very, very interesting development, which I'll return to, is while Western Europe is a bit iffy and I'm not sure about this Belt and Road business and so on, I tell you, you have to change your minds, baby. But the East and Central European states, the 16 states, have signed up to Belt and Road, so it's a 16 plus 1 grouping. And that's, I'll come back to that. So what I'm trying to explain is how China's rise in the context of East Asia is acting as a huge gravitational pull on the rest of the world in uneven ways, very strong in, for example, Africa, where most, if you look at the Pew opinion surveys, Africans are by and large view China very favourably. In other places, it's not so clearly like that. So you've got this reconfiguration taking place in the world with the rise of China. Now, I did say, let me also mention, in terms of Europe, I mean, there are now 3 West European countries that are signed up for Belt and Road. Greece, Portugal, and most importantly, but we'll see what happens, Italy, earlier this year, has signed up a memorandum of understanding in relation. So you can see that situation beginning to change in Europe, but there's a long way to go. Now, so what I'm saying really is, you know, we used to say all roads lead to Rome, then all roads led to London, and then all roads led to New York, all roads lead to Beijing, if you like, if you want an expression to sum this up, this tendency that I'm talking about. Now, that's about centripetalism. So what's happening there? There was my 16 plus 1 chart of the countries, all those countries have signed up for the Belt and Road project. Well, let me talk now about what's happening to the West. And as China is exercising this growing gravitational pull, exactly the opposite trend is happening in and to the West, which is centrifugalism, which is a growing loss of influence, cohesion, sense of identity, a loss of direction, an absence, by and large, of any notion of the future. And this is because, basically, you know, the wind's going out of the sails, they're losing power, they're essentially on the defensive, and so on. And I think if you want to understand what's happening in the West, and whether it's Brexit or all the various symptoms that we know about, then the overarching fundamental trend which is shifting the nature and character of politics and cultural debate and so on in the West is the rise of China, is the loss of power of the West and the rise in power in the East. And it is this that we have to really try and understand. It's very difficult to understand it. I mean, does anyone listen to the Today program here? Oh, only 2 or 3 of you, good. The audiences, I heard the audiences have been declining, but obviously in here it's pretty dire. I mean, you know, I have to ration myself because I find it so annoying. They don't live in the present. They live in the past. They don't know anything about none of the presenters know anything about China. None of them. I don't know where you know, what the hell can you comment on a program like that if you never go and you've never studied and you haven't got a presenter who really knows about that kind of thing? You know, we're still in the world where, you know, what's it called? The international system, or what's the expression people use for what? No, not Brentwood. No, I just. Yeah, no, the assumption is that the international opinion is synonymous with Western opinion. Okay? So they'll say, oh, well, you know, the international community, thank you. God, it only took me, thank you very much. Was it you? Okay. You can come and join me up here because I might need more help. The international community is a West, it's synonymous with the West. Well, how can you say that? You know, if you want to study what's happening in the world, and especially anywhere in the developing world, I want to know what China is doing and thinking, because I want to understand what is actually happening, not what we think as we talk to ourselves about it. And this is I think this is a tremendous problem, you know. I understand now why declining powers, declining regions and so on, historically find it very difficult to come to terms with what is happening, understand what is happening, because they think in an old paradigm. And the old paradigm has less and less purchase on reality. And so you've got no picture anymore. And the big problem, I think, in the West is the loss of a big picture. I mean, once we sure had a big picture. We wanted to run the world, and for a long time we did run the world, and we had a notion of where we wanted to take it and so on. But when you're on the back foot, on the defensive, in decline, diminishing in importance and influence in the world, you kind of become a prisoner of the past, and you're unable to understand fundamentally what's happening. I mean, I'd say to any of you here, if you want to understand anything about the future, please don't stay here. Please go and look what's happening in China. I would say that. You'll be shocked. I mean, probably a lot of you have been to China, but, well, I'm hoping you have. Because that gives you a sense of what's happening. And this is not a simple political question, by the way. I mean, so much of the commentary about China is like a political football. You know, you don't like this, you don't like that, blah, 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 blah. You know, you've got to get beyond that. And, I mean, you've got to get beyond the kind of absolute rubbish you get on China in The Guardian, a paper I take. But for The Guardian, China has become synonymous with human rights. If you want to understand China's influence in the world, where it's going, blah, 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 don't bother with The Guardian. It's a complete waste of space. I take this paper, okay? I've taken it for a long time. I write for it from time to time. But it makes me want to cry. That we can be so short-sighted, that we can be so bound up with our own agenda that we can't make sense of what's happening in the world. And this is absolutely crucial. We've got to understand what's happening in the world, because the longer we don't understand what's happening in the world, the longer it will take us to understand it and think about what we do in relationship to it. And that's a critical question. Okay. Now, let me give you some examples of this problem of centrifugalism. First, our own country, the UK. I mean, what's happening? I mean, there's many different expressions of this, many morbid symptoms, if you like, of decline. But one of them is the loss of authority of traditional Western nation states, of which ours is a classic example. Because as we become less important in the world, as our resources seemingly get more pinched, as we have less and less influence, so domestically our elites exercise less, enjoy less support, less charisma. Well, you can't really use that term anymore. And so on. And so what's happening? You know, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I mean, I tell you now, I've thought for quite a long time, actually, because I followed Scotland very closely from the 1970s, because I was very interested in the rise of the SNP. You know, Scotland is going to leave the UK. It's going to leave the UK. I'm not sure when. It could be very soon, if there's a no-deal Brexit. But Scotland is going to leave. Hence, changing, it's 300 years of history, isn't it? Something like that. Northern Ireland is obviously going to, at some point, join up with the Irish Republic. And Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, will become England and Wales. And that, I think, that's a very interesting expression of this centrifugal forces and the loss of the power and respect for elites. Second example, the European Union. Now, the European Union was a very, in many ways, very successful institution from the Treaty of Rome onwards in the 1950s. It started with 6, and then it grew to 10, and then it expanded, and then especially after 1989, when the East European and Central European states that were previously part of the Soviet bloc looked to Europe for their future. And so the European Union was an inexpansive period, attracting a lot of interest and engagement. But that period's come to an end now. And I think the reason it's come to an end, you see, the classic reason is this the classic reason, this is a classic illustration. What's happening is that these countries, which are on the outer bounds, if you like, of the European Union geographically, but are closer, if you like, to Asia, Middle East and so on, are looking to China. European Union can't offer them very much, they feel, or they're still there. They're not going to leave, I don't think, but they're you know, keeping their options open, I think, historically speaking. And they are looking to Belt and Road for the possibility of opening up new economic and economic possibilities for them. I mean, I tell you this, I think in the long run, Europe has absolutely no alternative in the long run. How long is the long run? I don't know how long the long run is. But to looking east rather than west. This is a very big problem for Europe, because Europe's looked to the west and across the Atlantic for so long. And many of the hopes and dreams and aspirations of Europe have been bound up with that Atlantic relationship. But actually, with the United States declining, then Europe will increasingly choose, in my view, to look east. But it's a very difficult process, because historically, you know, there's a lot of legacy tied up with our relationships and so on. But in the long run, that's, I think, what's going to happen, and that's the process that we're seeing. Third example. So first example, UK. Second example, EU, is centrifugalism. Third example is the fragmentation of the West. And we can see this very vividly, actually, in the present Trump era. But it's not just a function of Trump. With Europe and the United States looking in different ways at the world, you know, and this has been accelerated by Trump's turn against China. And Europe does not share that position in the same way as Trump. And so there's a lot of, and I think this has been happening over several decades, this slow estrangement or slow stretching of the relationship between the EU and the United States. And this is, again, a function of a world which is very different, because the West is no longer running the world in the same way that it did. And so each party, you know, the EU or the United States, is looking increasingly on its own account for working out how to deal with this. Which brings me to the United States. Now, America, and I'll come back to this briefly, America has decided under Trump, but there's a lot of bipartisan support for this, that China is now its peer competitor. It cannot bear this situation. It believes that America is, by its DNA, fundamentally number one in the world, and therefore it's turned against China to resist the rise of China and so on. This is a forlorn task. This will not work. I'll come back to this. This will not work. But it's the way, at the moment, America is trying to deal with the problem of its own decline. Of course, in the process, it's going to do a lot of damage. It's going to do a lot of damage to the global economy. It's going to do a lot of damage to China. It's going to do even more damage to the United States. But what I want to raise in your mind is, where is America going? I mean, it's becoming increasingly polarized. You can see old fault lines arising, of course, of race, but also linked to that, the Civil War and so on. And I think that in the longer run, I'm not at all sure, actually, that the United States, as we know it today, will survive its decline. I think that this is not to be, just like we would not have questioned Britain in 1945 whether it was going to remain intact as one. So I would also raise in your minds a question about what is likely to happen to the United States in not the age of the West, but now the age of centrifugal forces. Fifth point. I think there's a sense of displacement in the West. You know, of course, we talk about this in lots of different ways and so on, but, you know, what happens? And the West, we've all grown up, you know, the international community, thank you for this expression, the international community is essentially the West this, the West that, the global currency is the West, all the major international institutions for 200 years in various sequences have been essentially Western institutions, etc. Now, what happens when it's not? How are you going to deal with it? You know, how are you going to deal with a situation where really, I think English is going to survive as a very important language, but it's about time you started learning Chinese. But it's a very difficult language to learn for us, not least the pronunciation. And so I think that this is a deep problem, an overarching reason for what I've been talking about. Now, I think that that is essentially what I want to say about centrifugalism, and I just want to say a few words about the trade war, and then I want to talk about Belt and Road. And have I got any time left? Huh? 10 minutes. Wow, that's going to be tough. I'll speak very quickly. Right, well, this brings me to the subject of a brief word on the US and China, because it is very, very important what's happened. The question is, why did the US look favourable on China and the relationship with China between 1972, the Mao-Nixon talks, and 2016, where Trump shifts the position of the United States? I think there were two fundamental reasons. One was it was a hugely unequal relationship. China was tiny compared with the United States at the beginning, and over time, of course, it closed the gap. And the United States never ever believed that China could become its economic equal. And secondly, a deep assumption, deep in the bones of the West, not just America, was that China would become a Western-style country because we are the highest form of being and there is no alternative. And of course, you know, as I argued in my book a long time ago now, China was not going to become a Western-style country. China has a different history and a different culture and different roots, profoundly different. And it's never going to be a Western-style society. It never has been, it isn't, and it never will be. Two huge miscalculations that America made. Why? Because, you know, I mean, the thing is that hegemons are prisoners of their own hubris and their belief that they go on forever. I mean, there's no great imperial country that's ever entertained the idea in its pomp that it could possibly decline, whether it was the British Empire or the United States, or no doubt the same will happen with, in some degree or other, with China over time, and so on. Anyway, so recognition now in America, Christ, China is our equal, what are we going to do about it? Stop them. We must find a way of slowing their rise, or stopping their rise, or maybe we can find a way of reversing their rise, hence the tariff war, hence the attack on Huawei and the tech war, and so on. The problem is that it's not going to work, you know. You look at this. Take the tech. When I used to give talks several years ago, someone invariably in the audience would say to me, but China's done very well. Yes, grown very quickly, but basically by copying and imitating. When it comes to invention and creativity, that's the West. 2 of the top 6 tech firms in the world are now Chinese. Tencent and Alibaba. This is wonderful. This is a snapshot. There's a Kleiner Perkins produced, I think it's a weekly or monthly value chart of the top 20 tech, internet firms in the world. This one is in, took the one from 29th of May 2018. In 2013, only 2 Chinese companies in the top 20, 18 American, no European. Today, 11 US, 9 Chinese. I think we can see the direction of travel. Research and development. Let me just, do you like this? Where's the sound?
Hello, everyone. I'm an English artificial intelligence anchor. This is my very first day in Xinhua News Agency. My voice and appearance are modeled on Zhang Zhao, a real anchor with Xinhua. The development of the media industry calls for continuous innovation and deep integration with the international advanced technologies. I will work tirelessly to keep you informed as texts will be typed into my system, uninterrupted. I look forward to bringing you the brand new news experiences.
Okay, so I just, they're just little snippets I found that I thought would break up listening to my voice. But you can. But the point I want to emphasise is that that China will survive this trade war, and I mean the Americans. And it may develop as a new Cold War, but it won't be like the last Cold War, and it won't be like the last Cold War because look, that was Russia or the Soviet Union, and that is China. It was always economically a completely unequal contest between the USSR and the US. China is a rising power. The United States is a declining power. In the old Cold War, the United States was still a rising power. So, okay, so that interlude over, and I've got only 5 seconds for my whole of my last section on Belt and Road. How can you put me in this situation? I put myself in it, of course. But I want to say briefly something about it. Belt and Road, this is a most extraordinary project. Belt and Road, what's the Chinese thinking? I'll do this very quick. How long have I got? 5 minutes. You're not very generous. I thought you might squeeze a bit more. Belt and Road is, what's the Chinese thinking? The Chinese thinking, I think, is basically this, that we transformed ourselves by very large-scale investment, state-led investment, which achieved very rapid economic growth and a huge reduction in poverty, 800 million. We're not a model for others, but maybe this offers an insight into how other developing countries might be transformed or transform more quickly. Eurasia is the largest landmass in the world, 65% of the world's population. Most of it is underdeveloped. A lot of it the countries are landlocked, which is difficult in terms of modern trade. The only bit that's really developed, with the exception now, of course, of Japan and South Korea and so on, is Europe. So this is a huge project to transform Eurasia. Now, we would never think in these terms. This is a very Chinese way of thinking. This takes you back to the Great Wall, it takes you back to the Grand Canal, from Hangzhou to Beijing. They think on an extraordinary scale. Now, there's no time limit for this project. There's no time limit. Just like reform and opening up, there was never any. Deng Xiaoping had no time limit for it. It was open-ended. And this is also open-ended. What time scale I think we're talking about? 50 to 100 years. Not less than that. This idea. And the Chinese, why do the Chinese think, how do the Chinese think like that? It's a very big country. It's had a very long history. It's had some periods of great successes as well as periods where it's been very unsuccessful. So, you know, in its heyday, there was the tribute system, which was a sort of, you know, a regional international system, global equivalent in those times of today. And so it's a civil, I've argued in my book, but I haven't got time to explain this now. It's a civilization state. It's a hugely competent. I mean, China is a sub-global system. It's a country, it's a continent, it's a sub-global system. Therefore, I mean, it's hugely competent at governance. This is something we never discuss. I mean, governance has been reduced to a debate about how you elect the government, and we can talk about that as a separate issue in relation to China. But the West only raises this. I'm sorry, that's only half of the question. The other half of the question, if not more than half of the question, is your governance any good? Is it competent? Is it able to structure your future? Is it able to transform society? Is it able to answer the questions of that society? And when it comes to governance, I think the Chinese system is extraordinarily competent, much more competent than any Western country. So, so far, well, it's been first announced in 2013, first big summit 2017, which I attended, and the latest, which I also attended in 2019. There are now about 130 countries in the world signed up for Belt and Road. I tell you, there's no country in the world that could have mustered the kind of representativity of government leaderships around the world than that last one I went to. I mean, it was extraordinary. By and large, the West is notable for its absence, but not completely. We were represented by Hammond in this one. But by and large, Western wasn't so well represented. But America, of course, ignored Belt and Road completely. At first, this is not important, blah, 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 blah. And then it suddenly realized, oh, well, it is important, and started denouncing it, you know, came out with debt diplomacy and all this kind of thing, which is actually rubbish in my view, but I can answer questions on that. And so Belt and Road is going to Belt and Road is, if you like, the kind of expression of what I've been talking about in the first part of my talk, which is the way in which the world will get increasingly drawn towards East Asia and so on. Now, I'm going to stop with that because I've got so much more I'd like to say and finish with one thought for you. The present world order is clearly in deep trouble. The underlying reason for the deep trouble, in my view, is the decline of the West, especially the United States, and the rise of China. And this is the driving force of that decline of the existing system, because essentially China is not enfranchised properly within this system, either contemporaneously or historically. But there's another factor that's now also hastening this process, and that is Trump and his turn away from the kind of Western approach since 1945 with his emphasis on unilateralism and nationalism. So you've got sort of two forces now. You've got the deeper force, and you've got a more current political force in the form of Trump. And it seems to me, I've been rather patient in a way about how I see the global order changing, but I think the changes are going to happen in a more convulsive and faster form. Now, how does Belt and Road relate to that? Well, Belt and Road is not an alternative in any direct sense to the existing global order. But I do think that it is actually a critique of the existing global order and a suggestion of what a new global order might be like. You see, the existing global order is essentially the creature of the invention of primarily the West, and especially America, after the Second World War. The West today, although it was a bit more then, constitutes only 15% of the world's population. So we have a global order which, in a profound way, is unrepresentative of the world, and in that sense, undemocratic. Now, what about Belt and Road? Well, Belt and Road addresses, essentially, the developing world, because the way the Chinese define Belt and Roads to include Africa, you'd be interested to know, and, well, I suppose it is actually ultimately part of the Eurasian landmass, but even it stretches to Latin America. In other words, in some ways, Belt and Road is a metaphor for the developing world. And the developing world accounts for 85% of the world's population. In other words, there's an inclusivity which the existing global order fundamentally lacks. It also is the bearer of different values, which, of course, you would expect, because the developing countries' needs and the developed countries' needs are different. Essentially, the values that inform Belt and Road sort of cluster around the notion of development and the reduction of poverty and so on. And these are the sort of this is the key moving force behind Belt and Road. So it seems to me that what Belt and Road is a suggestion of what a future world order needs to be like in some sense and what it needs to encompass. Thank you. I'm sorry I've gone over time.
We have gone over time, but I would like just to take two questions. If we've got a couple of questions in the audience, just so Martin can answer those, to give you a chance to ask him one. So we'll start here first, and then I'll have one more. Yep.
Hi, my name's my name's Lucy Crisp. I'm head of corporate partnerships here at the University of Bath. You mentioned the West. Well, actually, you mentioned the Guardian's obsession with human rights. I suppose, as a history graduate, perhaps that comes from our own experience, and I talk about the last couple of generations or last couple of 100 years of where we've seen kind of growing economic capital for each individual has really aligned with a growing desire for freedom. And I suppose I wondered what your view is on the significance of recent events in Hong Kong in relation to China.
Okay.
Just a little question then, yeah?
And then one more question. Who have I got? Yeah, up here, yeah. Yeah, quickly take the mic, yeah. Yep, go on, yeah.
Okay, well, my name's knowledge. You've painted a picture whereby the rise of China is sort of problematic. You haven't actually said that, but what you've conveyed is that it's cataclysmic, I think is what one of the words you used. But isn't it true to think of China as beset with its own problems? Not only does it not get on very well with its neighbours, yes, economically, but under the surface, tensions with South Korea and Japan, increasing tensions with Vietnam, who's moving more to American sort of friendships, Indonesia likewise. And so what you have actually with China is a very powerful economic nation rising up, yes, but at the same time, circling it, including India, are not a bunch of friends. So the rise of the East may be, but long term, what's your view?
Well, I think my view is that that, of course, you know, I mean, you can't get the rise of something like China with its history and its sheer scale, not creating all sorts of problems, questions, anxieties, and so on. I mean, it would be ridiculous to think otherwise. And every country in the world, especially those closest to it in the region, have had to reconfigure and reconsider their relationship with China. I think your historical picture is actually very inaccurate in relationship to this region. I mean, if you look at the ASEAN countries, basically the ASEAN countries, which are Southeast Asian countries, 10 of them, are all recognize that their futures lie fundamentally with China. With China. Every one of them. The Philippines was the nearest to an exception because of its very different history. And it's still the most antipathetic to China because of its close links with the United States, of which it was also a former colony. But under Duterte, they've now opened up, become part of Belt and Road, and China is now their biggest trading partner, which it was not until quite recently. But Vietnam is a different question. Vietnam, you know, I know Vietnam historically has always had a problem with China. It goes back a very long time. It goes back, in fact, at least to the 15th century, when there was a war. China did something it never did, basically, during the tributary system era, which was to invade Vietnam. There was a long war, over 20-year war, and there's a deep antipathy amongst the Vietnamese towards China. But it's very complicated. China is their biggest trading partner. The Vietnamese political system is very similar to the Chinese system. Confucianism is a fundamental part of Vietnamese society in a way that is only equaled by Korea outside China. So I think that, and to say Vietnam's moving towards America is quite wrong. I mean, the Vietnamese, I admire the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese will seek support wherever they can get it on a limited basis, but don't think that it's moving towards the United States, because I think that's inaccurate. But it does raise the complications of China's relationship with other countries. And when you say beset with problems, I mean, yeah, actually, when I started speaking on my book and was speaking to Chinese audiences in China, I mean, almost invariably someone would get up and say, I think you're underestimating the problems we've got. You know, it's much more difficult. We aren't as blah, all sorts of things. And I admired their humility because they were doing very well, but they do have lots of problems. A developing country has a scale of problems which is quite different from a developed. What we regard as problems, the Chinese would not particularly think as problems, because when you're dragging your country up from nothing to where they've got to in a very short space of time, they've had to scale huge mountains of problems. So I think we should have a generosity towards what they've achieved historically. You know, the problem with so much of Western opinion is they're always carping about China, not when they don't really know much about it, and they don't really know what the transformation's been like and how it's been achieved. On Hong Kong, there's a short answer, but I'd prefer to give the long one. Because I know Hong Kong well, I lived there for 2.5 years and so on. This is a big problem, I think. And I think the Chinese have made some serious mistakes in Hong Kong. I think in principle, one country, two systems was a brilliant way of tackling the problem. But inbuilt to one country, two systems was two legacies of British rule. One was a colonial administration, which essentially is what Hong Kong still has, civil servant. And secondly, a colonial economy, i.e. the British ruled it by basically, with the tycoons, who you know, they go on about her heritage thing, foundation gives Hong Kong very high marks for freedom, etc. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, basically, it's awarding marks for low taxation, but it's an entirely oligopolistic economy, as colonial economies were generally. And unfortunately, the Chinese have not tackled this problem. So inequality, which was very high at the time of the handover, has got worse. So I think that the difficulty in Hong Kong is that, the Chinese have been operating one hand tied behind their back. Now, partly, what's the expression? They made a rod for their own back. Yes. Thank you. I prefer to do. In that they wanted to show they were good guardians of Hong Kong. I mean, when I went, we went to live there in '98, and I can only find one Chinese flag, which which is remarkably few, and they wanted to go sote voce. They wanted to convince the world they were good guardians and so on. And so I think they were in a way too conservative, with a small c, about the way they went about the problem. I mean, there needs to be a reform dynamic. The Hong Kong economy that the British left was in some ways successful, in some certain senses successful, but in other senses was a load of problems. And the Chinese decided that because they wanted to, try and ensure continuity, have not managed to tackle successfully. I mean, about the demonstrations and all that. I mean, it seems to me it's obviously the Chinese made the three biggest mistakes they made, on top of the structural things I've been talking about. One, the security law proposed, security bill in 2003. Secondly, the extradition bill this year, and third, the kidnapping of the booksellers, which was ridiculous. And this is really, Hong Kong opinion is a Western-style way of thinking and so on. And they know, Hong Kong knows nothing really about China, even though it's just up there. And so I think that the Chinese are going to have to really think hard about it. I think it's a very challenging situation. I think that the demonstration, huge demonstration, was representative of the majority of Hong Kong opinion. I don't think these other demonstrations, which are violent, which you would never tolerate in the UK, enjoy broad support. The Chinese are obviously finding it difficult to know how to handle a situation. They don't have much, in that sense, they don't have much experience of dealing with something like that. And they're hoping that, things will peter out. But the underlying problem they've got to address is these structural questions. This is the real problem. Because Hong Kong, in 1997, at the time of the handover, the Hong Kong economy was 1/3 of the size of China's economy. Today, it is less than 3%. It was obviously a very important financial sector, etc., the port. Now, Shanghai and Shenzhen are on a par with Hong Kong in virtually all these respects. And just over the border in Shenzhen was the formerly a fishing village, which Deng Xiaoping established to try and learn from Hong Kong. And they have become, one of the most important cities in the world. This is the alternative to Silicon Valley. This could have been Hong Kong. But one of the British legacies was a colonial economy, and it doesn't have that way and that spirit, that engineering capacity, that practicality, which the Chinese have got in PRC. So the Chinese have got a lot of thinking to do, but the one good thing is so far they've acted with great restraint. I was crossing my fingers.
Okay, well, Martin came all the way from Indonesia straight to...
No, Manila.
Manila, sorry.
Before that, Beijing. Before that, Shanghai. Thank you. And now Bath. I've finally made it.
So we asked him to set out some of the big forces changing the world, and I think he's done that very well for us this morning. So I want to thank you very much indeed, Martin Jacques, for your time.
Thank you.